right, welcome everybody to Finding Truth. Tonight we're going to be talking about the fine tuning of the universe and whether or not it leads to the conclusion that there is a God. And with us, we have Travis Worth, who is going to be basically making a positive case that yes, it does. And then we have JMIKE, who has a lot of questions that he wants to ask to Travis. And he may have some good ideas as to why maybe it doesn't lead to God. So, Mike, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Let us know who you are, some of the things that you have been doing lately, and then we'll go to Travis after that.
Sure. Well, first off, thank you for having me on, and thank you, Travis, for wanting to have the discussion. I really appreciate it. I've seen a couple of your discussions, and I really appreciate you applying the science and all that type of stuff. So I wanted to give appreciation for that up front. But yeah, so I'm JMIKE. I run a podcast called Axioms On Trial with a co-host of mine who is a much smarter man than myself. So I kind of just lean on his wisdom a lot. But I run a podcast with him. We talk to physicists, philosophers. We debate, we host debates, pretty much anything, everything kind of in this nerdy space of discussion with philosophy, religion, science. We cover pretty much anything within that. I also host Talk Heathen, which is a product of the ACA, which also does the atheist experience, as well as the nonprofit secular sexuality and Truth Wanted. And so if you want to go check me out on Sundays, you can go check out Talk Heathen. Sometimes I'm on Atheist Experience. And then tomorrow I'm on the line with Matt Dillahunty. So that'll be fun. So that's pretty much the stuff I like to do. And I'm a computer programming major. So I don't have any really relevant expertise in these fields. I just like the hobby of the discussions.
All right. And with that, we're going to go with Travis. And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Travis?
Okay, yeah, great. So I'm Travis. Been a Christian for about 4 years now. I'm working on finishing my master's in atmospheric science. I really have a passion for science, and I really enjoy talking and discussing the fine tuning. I love it. But other than that, I'm a co-host on Proselytize or Apostatize, and working on finishing a certificate of science apologetics through Reasons to Believe. And yeah, man, I'm just super stoked to have this discussion.
All right, so what we're gonna do is you guys are gonna have 15 minutes to do basically like an intro to your case, and then after that we're just gonna have a cross-examination, or you guys just can talk about your ideas and do that for like maybe 25 minutes or something like that, and then let the audience ask some questions to both of you guys. And Travis, why don't you go ahead and get us started, and then JMIKE and I will just sit back and listen to you, and I'll probably take some notes.
Okay, sounds good. I'll go ahead and start. Okay, so what I'm wanting to do is present a somewhat novel approach to the fine-tuning argument, using a combination of arguments from Hugh Ross and Richard Swinburne through a lens of theistic idealism, using principles in the philosophy of science, and see if we can kind of look at this in a more illuminating and testable way that can help us form an inference to the best explanation. The fine-tuning data suggests that the universe may have been designed not just for any kind of life, but for embodied moral agents in particular. This idea can be more rigorously tested and established through more detailed comparisons of the fine-tuning data required for the support of the following life forms. 1. Simple life, such as unicellular life that persists for 90 days or less. 2. Permanent simple life, such as unicellular life that persists for 3 billion years or longer. 3. Advanced biological life, including the equivalent of Homo sapiens. 4. Intelligent, consciously self-aware, embodied moral agents capable of launching and sustaining a high-tech global civilization in which morally significant decisions can be made in a moral theater. If the fine-tuning differences dramatically increase with the complexity of successive categories, and if the fine-tuning required for the fourth category is extreme at all levels of cosmic structure, laws of physics, universe as a whole, cluster of galaxies, planetary system, planet, moon, surface of the planet, and life on the planet's surface, then it's reasonable to conclude that the universe exists for a specific purpose, especially if this conclusion can be put to an additional test by determining the comparative degree to which evidence for the fine-tuning demands of the fourth category increases in relation to the others, and can demonstrate that any alleged hostility of conditions in the universe are in fact used in the production of the fourth category. Now, to go through some of the data, there are 140 fine-tuned parameters that are necessary for a life-permitting universe, such as, the precision and the fundamental forces that produce heavy elements, things like the mass density of the universe is necessary for heavy elements to build up, the life chemistry. It also controls, the precision and the expansion rate, which is what, forms galaxies, stars, planets, and everything. And so these 140 fine-tuned perimeters of a life-permitting universe are pretty much well established. And so I'd like to kind of focus more in on how it keeps growing. So in our cluster of galaxies, with the precision already required with the 140 fine-tuned perimeters, we see increasing precision, and that we have to have the precise galaxy type for sufficient infusion of gas to sustain star formation for long enough periods of time, as well as preventing galaxy collisions and mergers from disrupting solar orbit. We need the precise galaxy mass, the precise galaxy type that has to have the just right elliptical precision for star formation and efficient heavy element buildup. It's necessary for life chemistry, as well as it prevents extreme radiation exposure. We need the proximity of solar nebula to a supernova eruption for sufficient heavy element absorption, as well as preventing nebulas from being blown apart. The number of stars in the parent star birth aggregate are necessary for the input of certain heavy elements into the solar nebula and preventing planetary orbits from being disrupted. Even the star formation history in the star's parent vicinity, which, had it been too soon, then planet formation and planet orbits would be too radically disturbed for life. We need things like the parent star color, which, had it been more red or more blue, then photosynthetic responses would be insufficient. And the list for the fine-tuning of the cluster of galaxies goes on and on. Now, in our own solar system, of course, we have things like, we have things like Jupiter that helps prevent asteroid collisions. We have to be the exact proximity from the sun, and the list goes on and on in that aspect. But to focus in on the planetary collision with Theia that happened about 4.5 billion years ago and actually formed our moon. So this crash replaced Earth's thick atmosphere with one that was thin enough for light to pass through. The new atmosphere had the just right chemical compositions to foster life's existence. It boosted the mass and density of Earth just enough to allow Earth's gravity to retain a large, but actually not too large, quantity of water vapor for billions of years. And it raised the amount of iron in Earth's core closer to the level needed to provide Earth with a strong and enduring magnetic field, which shields life from deadly cosmic rays and solar X-rays. It delivered to Earth's core and mantle quantities of iron and other associated elements in the just right ratios to produce long-lasting plate tectonics that, of course, build up continents. And these plate tectonics also perform a crucial role in compensating for the sun's increasing luminosity so that life can be sustained on Earth for billions of years. It raised the iron content of Earth's crust in a way that permits a huge abundance of ocean life that in turn supports advanced land life. It played a major role in salting Earth's interior with an abundance of long-lasting radioisotopes. The heat from which drives most of Earth's plate tectonic rotation rate so that a wide variety of lower life forms could survive long enough to provide the resources needed for the existence of more advanced life forms. This slowing is also significant to advanced life that cannot survive the high wind velocities of a more rapid rotation rate. So this stabilized the tilt of Earth's rotation axis, which protected the planet from rapid and extreme climatic variations. Each of these characteristics altered Earth to make conditions far more favorable for living creatures. And of course, there's also things like, the late heavy bombardment period, faint sun paradox, and so forth. But to focus in a little bit on life on the planet's surface, so we have things like sulfate-reducing bacteria that redistributed the poisonous elements left over from Earth being salted with heavy elements. Sulfate-reducing bacteria supplied much, if not all, of the concentrated and economic to mine ore deposits of iron, magnesium, zinc, lead. Ores of trace metals like silver, arsenic, and vital poisons may similarly owe their concentrations to sulfate-reducing bacteria. The dominance of sulfate-reducing bacteria for nearly 1 billion years or more early in life's history paved the way for advanced life, especially future intelligent moral agents who can manufacture a global civilization. Because it took the easy-to-mine vital poisonous ores produced over the past few billion years. This sulfate-reducing bacteria helped to equip humanity for a high-tech global civilization. When we look at things like the greenhouse gas removal, okay, so in the erosion process, water from rain, streams, and mist catalyzes the chemical reaction between silicates and atmospheric carbon dioxide. The end products are carbonates and silicon dioxide, and to get the necessary amount of exposed silicates, plate tectonics must build up islands and continents. The rate of silicate erosion depends on the Earth's rotation rate, the average global rainfall, the average global temperature, the chemical composition of Earth's atmosphere, the total area of Earth's land masses, the average slope of Earth's land masses, and the quantities and types of plants on the land. So then we get organisms like photosynthetic plants, bacteria, and methanogens that take carbon dioxide, water, and methane from the atmosphere and chemically transform them into sugars, starches, fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. Now, if these get buried before they decay or get eaten by other organisms who then get buried before they decay, we get greenhouse gases converted into biodeposits through physical and chemical processes operating in the Earth's crust. The end products of this greenhouse gas removal are things like coal, oil, natural gas, limestone, marble, phosphates, and sand, all of which are necessary for launching and sustaining a high-tech global civilization. Without billions of years of greenhouse gas removal from the Earth's atmosphere and the conversion of these gases into biodeposits, human civilization would never have taken off and achieved its current level of technology. And just briefly, we have things like functioning ecosystems of predator to prey relationships and parasites. Things like the surface gravity is necessary to regulate the amount of ammonia and methane, and then, prevent the planet from losing too much water. We have the precise carbon dioxide level for plants to maintain efficient photosynthesis, the precise water vapor level in the atmosphere to regulate precipitation on the land. The precise atmospheric conditions. Even simple things like the amount of leaf litter on the ground actually helps soil nitration. Then, epochs in history like the Triassic and the Jurassic periods help lay down the fossil fuels that intelligent agents would evolve to use in manufacturing a high-tech global civilization. Not to mention the quality of like the tallest trees and everything goes into the lumber that's used for a high-tech global civilization. And the list goes on for how everything is precise for embodied conscious moral agents to manufacture a global civilization. But to continue with the argument, we see the increasing precision that it takes to go from things like just a life-permitting universe to one with a planet that can support primitive life, to more advanced life, to complex life, to embodied moral agents who can manufacture a global civilization to make morally significant decisions, which also gives us a sort of testing measure by examining the increasing precision with each category. For example, it takes a lot more precision for the evolution of intelligent moral agents than it does for the formation of things like supernovas and black holes. So with this, I think we can see intelligence, intentionality, and immense power in forming a moral theater. This is what I would expect to find if there's a necessary rational mind that grounds and unifies all the facts of reality, such as these: physics and fine-tuning, universal mathematics, objective morality, laws of logic, principles of reason, and so forth, that are all emergent from the mind of God in theistic idealism. Theistic idealism is a rival hypothesis to naturalism to explain these sets of facts, keeping in mind that it's not the universe and God, it's all of reality that is deducible in substance to the mind of God. Therefore, God is not constrained within these laws of physics and narrow conditions. In fact, theism postulates that God created the very laws of physics and narrow conditions in the first place. So we get narrow conditions as a byproduct of God's intentionality to bring about embodied moral agents in a moral theater. It's this intentionality which gives us explanatory power, as well as other theoretical virtues such as evidential accuracy. Theism fits the described facts well. Causal adequacy. Theism's causal factors plausibly produce the evidence in need of explanation and covers a wide explanatory depth. Coherential virtues such as internal consistency. Theism's components for explaining are not contradictory. Internal coherence. Theism lacks theoretical components tacked on merely to solve isolated problems. Universal coherence. Theism is not obviously contradictory to other warranted beliefs. Aesthetic virtues. Theism invokes an aesthetic pleasure in a beautifully ordered cosmos. Simplicity and unification. Theism, especially theistic idealism, explains more facts as rivals with the same amount of theoretical content. In other words, it's going to posit much less brute facts. Even virtues such as fruitfulness. because under theism, an intentionality for embodied moral agents would be an expected matter of course advocated prior to the fine-tuning evidence, which can now be independently measured through the increasing teleological precision of successive categories 1 through 4. As Richard Swinburne states in his paper on the prior probabilities in the argument from fine-tuning, quote, theism is a far simpler hypothesis, and so a priori more probably true than naturalism, understood as the hypothesis that the existence of this law-governing universe has no explanation. Theism postulates only one entity, God, with very simple properties, whereas naturalism has to postulate either innumerable entities all having the same properties, or one very complicated entity with the power to produce the former. If theism is true, it is moderately probable that God would create human beings, and so human bodies. But laws of nature would have to be very precise and have very special properties if they are to bring about the existence of human bodies. Given laws of the present form, like quantum theory with the Pauli principle and the four forces, the constants and laws and variables of the boundary conditions of the universe, it would need to be extremely fine-tuned, and no simpler set of laws would allow the existence of human bodies at all. So the evidence of the existence of human bodies adds further to the probability of theism over naturalism, end quote. Therefore, based on this collected data, I would argue that the increasing ratio of fine-tuning required for categories 1 through 4 exists. Theism would explain the data. Theism would offer the best explanation of the data. Thus, there is plausible reason to conclude theism is true. And so with that, I will turn it back over, guys.
All right, all right. Well, you still had close to a minute, so
I was trying to hurry up and get it all out there.
So that was pretty good.
And you were worried, Travis. You were worried at the beginning. You're like, I don't know if I'll fit it all, and you had a minute to spare.
Yeah. Well, I had to condense it, but I can bring up more stuff like during the discussion if
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully I don't talk past you in my opening statement. I'm going to be dealing a little bit more with I would say the cosmological aspects of it, as well as, I mean, I did tell you beforehand that there are some questions I have from the biological perspective as well. But maybe we'll just address those, and if we shift back and forth between the two, then so be it. But first, thank you guys for having me on. This won't be much of an opening statement as much as I want to try to track down where my headspace is in all these conversations, and apologize to the audience if I fumble over my words. It's been a long 24 hours of no sleep, so I'm going to try to get through this. But first and foremost, I'm not necessarily convinced that there is a fine-tuning problem, nor will I pretend to have the expertise in the necessary fields to make the case that there actually isn't one. I would, however, like to briefly discuss with Travis some concerns I have with fine-tuning. But that said, I want to try to mainly focus on whether or not the apparent fine-tuning can be best explained by postulating some new ontological entity, God. I want to point out first that we clearly do not have a God available that's deemed to serve as any explanation for any claim we possibly make. I'm extremely skeptical of how we go from a basis of scientific inquiry into a metaphysical thesis involving some undiscovered ontology, perhaps with specific Trinitarian properties or desires to have personal relationships with its creation, endowing moral obligations. In science, we are dealing with methodological naturalism, so it isn't an attempt at a metaphysical thesis that all there is the natural world, nor does it use God as a relevant factor in making novel predictions. We're talking about why, we're not talking about how. And I think Travis might agree with me here on the role of science. Perhaps that might be something we need to elucidate further in the discussion. But to stay on track, the idea that we would invoke a supernatural source as fine-tuning's cause or explanation seems to be on par with me just postulating a group of cosmic programmers attempting to recreate conditions and constants of their own universe, or me just saying that it affirms that there is no God. I don't know how we separate these claims, given that we have no a posteriori evidence for them independently. How many events have we confirmed through a supernatural origin? The answer is 0, because again, science doesn't need to incredulously invoke supernatural causation into its framework. It wouldn't even matter how improbable something is. It simply doesn't follow to answer a mystery with an even bigger mystery. And I have numerous issues I find important that me and Travis discuss if there's any hope in swaying my skepticism on the side of theism. One, what are even the conditions of life at which life can exist, and how can we know that with a single sample size? If anyone's going to argue the universe is fine-tuned for life, they need to demonstrate that these are the only constants that support it, all while having one sample size to do so. Two, it seems that he needs to show exactly how we can calculate the odds that a god is more likely to explain the fine-tuning than any other possible explanation. In other words, how do we avoid suffering a problem of underdetermination? What would a falsification criterion even look like for this supernatural explanation? Number three, why is the god restricted to physical constants? The idea of fine-tuning is an admission that the god is limited in some way. Clearly, an all-powerful god isn't going to be tripped up on his way to make the universe or have things persist within it. It appears you would find a more parsimonious explanation for specific constants under naturalism, where, say, the mass of a neutrino might actually matter, but wouldn't a god be able to create a life where the ratio of the masses of the electron, the muon, and the tau neutrinos have any relevance to the desired outcome? It seems he could just make that any arbitrary assignment. He doesn't need to deal with physical constraints. Why is an all-powerful being limited to the fine-tuning? Of course, we could just bite the bullet and admit that he isn't, but then we have no basis to argue for the fine-tuning to begin with. I'd also like to know why God isn't alternatively fine-tuned for creating black holes. And how do we know that that God is fine-tuned for life? That seems to just kick the can down the road to say that God sufficiently serves as this explanation without demonstrating why it ultimately couldn't be the case that its desires are tuned for creating a universe with an abundant amount of black holes rather than life. How do we even get to say that the universe is even deliberately designed when less than 1 part in 10 to the 50th of the end product is even suitable to sustain the thing it was designed for in the first place? It seems like this would be analogous to a factory that is designed to produce sheets of aluminum, but produces tens of millions of pounds of anthrax every day and only 1 sheet of aluminum every 10,000 years. This is an admission of an extremely fragile and counterproductive design from my perspective, and only serves to downgrade the role and power of the deity. Now, a lot of people spend a lot of time on specific constants like the Planck constant, gravitational constant, the charge of the electron, and assert that if they're slightly off, life would not be possible. So my first issue with that is that it doesn't logically follow to say that if a variation in a constant made life impossible, that it follows to be unnatural or supernatural. I don't know how that deductively follows. It seems that we'd have need to look at some syllogism at which we premise conclusion and see how that actually concludes the way that is meant to. We have zero implicit or empirical basis for this assertion, but more importantly, we don't have alternate constants to examine. It'd be on par to provide any alternative explanation without some novel predictions separating the conjecture. It suffers a problem I'd coin metaphysical underdetermination. I can rival this claim with some other basis, natural or not, but all while it's being devoid of novel predictions necessary to distinguish a more viable hypothesis. Do we have any access to any other universe to determine the evidence that it could have been any other way? We clearly don't have another universe to observe. We cannot rewind time, and it would be tautological just to say that our universe is finely tuned for the way it currently is, a position I'm sure my interlocutor does make a specific distinction on. From a modal perspective, how do we rule out possible worlds with different constants where life persists? I mean, if we look at the mass of a neutrino, for example, the ratio of the masses of the electron, the muon, and the tau neutrinos is important, but the exact mass seems to be arbitrary. It just needs to be close to zero. The precise mass it takes, it doesn't seem to be important, rather than the ratio of the masses between them. If someone is going to argue that the mass of the neutrino must be, say, 2.14 times 10 to the negative 37 kilograms, and state that if it was 2.14 times 10 to the negative 38 kilograms, the gravity would be too weak and the universe would expand too fast, or if it was 2.14 times 10 to the 36 kilograms, the additional gravity would cause the universe to collapse, in both cases resulting in a universe with no potential for life. The worry that I have, and where I want to ask Travis maybe some clarifying questions, is whether or not we might be exaggerating some measurements involved. The example that I like to use that I feel is analogous is to measure a person's height in light years. Say we measured Michael Jordan as 2 times 10 to the negative 15 light years in height and stated that if he was 2 times 10 to the negative 14 light years in height, he would be too tall to play basketball. And if he was 2 times 10 to the negative 16, he would be too small to play basketball. Well, this would be the case because in one instance, you have a 60-foot giant, and in the other case, you have an 8-inch action figure. If, say, instead we had measured his height at 78 inches, which I'm not sure if that's actually what it is, and stated it was if he was fluctuated between 3 inches shorter or taller, I would contend that Michael Jordan would probably still be in the NBA and he would still probably be one of the best. So similarly, if we measured neutrinos in electron volts or picograms, my skepticism is whether or not a similar fluctuation doesn't create the asserted detrimental conditions for life. That could be, and I'm willing to admit that could come down to my own ignorance of dimensionless physical constants, but it appears the person making the arguments for fine-tuning has to show why it has to be a specific measurement, one that I'm not sure physics has narrowed down so finely in the first place. But then again, I have no relevant expertise when it comes to that conjecture. I'm also not sure how it logically follows to say that another set of constants wouldn't be conducive to life. If we only have one universe to observe, it just leads us back to having only access to the one. If we have a square in which its sides measure 2 meters in length, and we say that if any of the sides were other than 2 meters, it would no longer be a square. It's finely tuned to be a square. Well, it's fallacious to argue that it only can exist in virtue of 4 2-meter sides. A 1.9 meter side would no longer make it a square due to its requirement for that specific square having a 2-meter length relationship. But this doesn't negate the fact that you can have a square at measurements of 1 meter or 50 meters, or having all 4 at 1.9 meter sides. Similarly, I'm not sure how we conclude life must have some specific set of constants and a certain relationship. And more importantly, if this was the case, we could give all the toys to play with, so to speak, and I still fail to see God as the relevant explanation, nor do I think it avoids the same problems that its proponents often criticize. All that said, I'm extremely sympathetic to the argument and have immense respect for Travis and others that look at actual empirical data at an attempt to justify their deeply held beliefs. I find that highly respectable, and I look forward to the discussion. So, thank you.
All right. So that was good. You had like
a lot, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like over
Yeah.
5
Well,
minutes.
I got a lot of questions. I typically sometimes in like discussions, debates, I don't even do opening statements. I just go off the cuff. But with this one, I definitely wanted to jot some things down so we'd have I track kind of my thoughts, as there's a lot to talk about within this topic, so.
And I'm glad you did. It allowed me to take a break.
All right. Well, how do you guys want to continue? Do you guys want to just go ahead and, for example, Travis ask some questions to JMIKE really quick, or JMIKE, do you want to get started? How do you guys want to do that?
Yeah, I mean, Travis, I guess if it would be fair to you, since you're making kind of the claim that it does lead to the explanation of a God, I guess my first question I would want to ask you is, what are the conditions at which life can exist, and how do we know that with just a single sample size?
Okay, so I noticed like a lot of your objections kind of come down to this, like this thing of like sample size. Like, we don't have other universes to measure it's life permitting. Is that where you're going? I'm trying to understand. Like,
I wouldn't say it's like the biggest contention. I mean, that is a big contention. There's other issues I have. One, to just even say that, okay, this is the case. This is, all we have are these constants. That's it. That's all we can have. I still don't see how it follows that it must be God. That would probably be my actual biggest contention.
Gotcha.
But this is one I think if you make an argument for fine tuning, then you have to at least give what the conditions for what life can exist. And then I have to know in virtue of how you know that without alternatives.
Okay, gotcha. So, when we look at things like, the fundamental forces and everything, that's what's going to like allow a lot of these heavy elements that build up that are going to form in the nuclear furnace of stars, right? Mm-hmm. And it's precise such that it forms the life chemistry that we need, and that goes into, eventually forming like galaxies and rocky planets and everything. So and if the variables were off, you don't get a life permitting universe. So it's pretty uncontroversial that the constants have to be right in order for a life permitting universe. And as far as I know, like carbon based life is the only kind of life that can exist.
Okay, so I'm sorry, can I stop you there? Because I have two
Sure.
kind of objections that are relevant to that. One, from my understanding, we do have kind of aspects in biology where we could say silicon or germanium life could be possible. So I'd be curious on that. But more importantly, there does seem to be contention. I had two astrophysicists on my podcast the other day that don't agree with the constants. I don't think Roger Penrose does, if I'm not mistaken, and I know Sean Carroll disagrees. So I would say that that it's not as cut dry as you're making it out to be.
Well, what I've heard from astrophysicists is there are certain ways, like you can lower one, but when you lower one, you need increased precision on the other. But here's the thing: my argument is I'm not really so much focused on that as I am, and I kind of wanted to get into this issue of a sample size, because what I'm doing is I'm saying, like, look, you have these type of life forms, and we can measure the increasing precision for just like a universe that will permit life. Well, the precision doesn't stop there; it keeps growing until the cluster of galaxies has to be precise, and then we have the precise planetary systems, and then life on the planet's surface, and all these things. The most precision in the universe is for embodied moral agents. And so I kind of wanted to, with the sample size, that's why I say let's look at the comparative degree to which the evidence for the fine-tuning jumps from things like unicellular life. It's like simple bacteria, then more, bacteria that grows in oceans and lakes and everything that can survive for 3 billion years or longer. Well, the precision keeps growing when we get into the evolution of Homo sapien, or the equivalent of Homo sapiens. And then it's even further for intelligent, consciously self-aware, embodied moral agents to have the intelligence and capacity to launch a global civilization to make morally significant decisions. So the precision in the universe accumulates in morality and moral agents. And so that's the trajectory of my argument, more than just the constants.
Okay, so I would have a probably even bigger objection, because I'm a moral anti-realist. So I think that there's an issue with looking at the natural world in any aspect and declaring that you've somehow discovered normativity. I don't think that. So I'd have an issue there. Maybe we set that. That would probably be, that was one of the first questions I wanted to ask you too, with the whole moral aspect of it.
Okay.
But to go kind of back first, it seems so, like you said you were a theistic evolutionist, right?
Correct.
So the fear I have is that it seems that now I'm in a game with you where I can't really win, because in the process at which I am going to look at say the development of the eye or the evolution of the eye, you're always going to have that. There's the designer behind it. Whereas when we're looking at those processes, they're actually happening unguided through natural processes. And so you would have to actually add some new, ontological guiding hand, God, right? Whereas it seems like mine's going to be more parsimonious. You're going to have another assumption, but then even if I go, hey, well, look at the processes of evolution, and it's not being, from what we can tell, we don't need to add that extra assumption. But if you're kind of baking that into it, I'm wondering, it feels like you're dealing me cards and you know what they are. I can never win, almost, it seems. But I don't know if you're following what I'm saying there.
Yeah, I am. Okay. And so when you talk about, positing, more entities to explain the data, I don't think so, because I'm arguing for theistic idealism, which would incorporate all of reality. Like I was saying, like the physics and fine tuning, moral agency, which we'll put to the side, laws of mathematics, logic, and things of that sort. It's going to unify all of these. And a good way to look at, God bringing things about by natural processes is, let's say I want to raise my hand, right? So I have the intention to raise my hand, and there's neural firings and muscle contractions that happen as a byproduct of me just intending to raise my hand. Sure. So likewise, I think God intends to bring about moral agency, and then these natural processes flow in as a byproduct. And so I think I'm putting a pretty simple unifying explanation out there.
Sure, but so I'm worried it like begs the question in the sense of that it's not it wouldn't answer my initial question to say, like, especially with the sample size, because a moral realist or a moral naturalist, right, they're just going to disagree with you and say that yes, normativity exists in the world, there are moral facts, there are moral obligations, and they might even actually posit the fact that generally in theism, at least in philosophy, it's more under subjectivism than it is under objectivism. And so they're going to make that argument. So I guess my issue is you still haven't really shown that this is the only case that it could have some endowment of like normativity or moral obligations. It seems that begs the question for the moral naturalist or someone to say, yeah, that could exist without God. Why is that? Why do you need why does unicellular life to I think the word you used specifically was, I don't want to get it wrong, endowing with moral agency or something like that.
Not quite, but
embodied moral agents or something like that, right? Was that it?
Yeah, it's more than just, it's intelligent embodied moral agents, who have the capacity to like take these things, and they like the even the biodeposits throughout the 4.56 billion year history of the earth is precise to make a civilization in which these morally significant decisions can be made. Now, I understand you're not sympathetic to moral realism, but that's
I'm kind of arguing. So I'm kind of taking
it's not really controversial.
Well, so I'm taking myself out of my shoes as a moral anti-realist, right? It's like my co-host on my show, he's a moral realist. He would argue, right? No, that doesn't prove the God or that there's a creator behind it, because I believe in those things. I believe in moral obligations. I believe in normativity from that process, but I don't add God to it, right? So we're still back to the initial question, which is how do you go from declaring that with one sample size? Because is it logically contradictory to say that those things could exist without God?
No, you can posit it as.
I just want to say, like, so even though we're talking about the morality and all that stuff, I would like to kind of like jump to another part of the argument later on in a few minutes, maybe. If you guys want to close those thoughts on that, because I would like to focus a little bit more in the evidence of the fine tuning and all that stuff rather than talking about the morality and all those things. Because I think
well, if I can interrupt real fast, Santi, Travis, I thought that was part of like your argument. So if like that's important to you, then I don't want to take that away from your argument, because I feel like that would be kind of undercutting what you're prepared for.
No, so okay. Now here's the thing: when we talk about sample sizes, that's why I'm saying, like, look, you can compare different types of life, like bacteria, plants and animals, advanced like Homo sapiens, and then intelligent moral agents who have the capacity to launch a high-tech global civilization. And with the increasing complexity and precision that increases with each category, that gives us a testing measure to detect intentionality. Like, it takes more precision for the evolution of embodied moral agents. And then not only that, but we have like consciousness. And when I posit theistic idealism, it's not the universe plus God, it's all of reality that's deducible to the mind of God. And so I'm not positing extra brute facts. And so theistic idealism is going to have less brute facts in that sense than naturalism. And I think it's a good explanation, because if God, under the proposition that God exists, if he's a moral agent, then it's moderately probable he's going to create moral agents. And so, I think the fine-tuning evidence would be an expected matter of course under theism, whereas a naturalism, this level of complexity for intelligent agents is quite surprising.
Sure, but if now we've like kind of focused on aspects of morality, or even like say you were saying you were going to present some something about God being necessary, right, or maximally great being, and so you use like a modal ontological argument. Well, then I don't feel like we need the fine-tuning argument, because you would just have convinced me from the aspects of either the moral perspective or whatever that other a priori argument is, and therefore I wouldn't even need the fine-tuning, because I just buy into the belief in God, and virtue of normativity can only exist in virtue of there being a God, right? And so I wouldn't even need the fine-tuning part of that at all. You would just have to you wouldn't have to unwind the ball of yarn so far back to the fine-tuning. I mean, you would just present, look, there's objective moral facts in the world and God exists, and then we go home. We don't even have to get to the fine tuning. So it seems like it undercuts arguing for fine tuning at that point.
No, okay, so it's basically saying that, God as a moral agent, it would be moderately probable that he would want to create moral agents. And so if he intends to create moral agents in a moral theater, where we can make these morally significant decisions under the posture, just granted theism, okay, it would be probable that he would create us, right? And so we can test this by looking at the increasing precision with each category. So it's like a way of measuring the intentionality, like I was saying. And when we talk about not having sample sizes, that's what I'm laying out those for, is those categories. We can look at the increasing complexity of those categories, which gives us a way to detect intentionality.
Okay, I'm wondering how we declare its intentionality, right? Because the moral naturalist, again, is going to say that these processes unguided that get us to natural facts of the world, prescribing normativity, how we ought to behave. They're not going to look at that and go, because they're looking at the same exact data as you, right? And then they're going, this is what I said in my opening statement about it's like a metaphysical underdetermination problem. It's like, I don't see why the moral naturalist, they're going to go, yeah, there's no intentionality in those unguided processes. That's why I don't believe in the God. It's because I don't see intentionality. I actually see random mutations in selection for traits, and then I see normativity arising out of kind of the ashes, so to speak.
Gotcha. So I think theism is, we have these, these sets of facts, right? And theism, I think, is going to offer a better explanation of why this should be the case, and it's going to posit less brute facts than that type of naturalism. And it's not just moral agents; it's intelligence, consciousness, and everything. And theism can explain why we have this. Theism can explain the data that we have. It's fruitful in that aspect. It would be an expected matter, of course, whereas under naturalism, it's not. This is not going to be expected. It's going to be improbable that a universe should be tuned for the existence of human bodies.
But I think in tandem to your argument, especially going to like embodied moral agents, in a naturalist world, you would expect to see this mishmash of moral ideals that are entirely contradictory to each other, which like like I think, what is it, Mackey, it's like, what does a moral fact even look like at that point? We don't, that's what is kind of the queerness argument. It's like, what would that even look like? I'm not sure like how we go. That leap to me seems a little odd. I don't know how you justify it to say that it would be more probable under theism. I don't know how we have the data for that, given that we don't have God as the candidate explanation to begin with.
Well, that's why I'm applying the theoretical virtues to it. We run it, we can absolutely use these theoretical virtues in metaphysics. So I'm using like the principles of the philosophy of science and applying it metaphysically of why we have this reality. And I'm offering it as the best explanation, because under the proposition, and I don't want to keep repeating this, but under the proposition that God is moral agent, it's probable he would want to bring it about. And if he intends to bring it about, we have the kind of evidence that we have. And so it offers the best explanation.
Yeah. And so I hit on what you're saying with, you're kind of looking at it from philosophy of science, but I guess I'm highlighting a problem in philosophy of science, which is just just a simple problem of underdetermination, right? Like, I don't know, like, in virtue of what is theism more, because you're saying like intentionality, but the moral naturalists would just deny that. They go, yeah, I don't see intentionality there. That has to be demonstrated. And so if you're saying in virtue of that, then what is the novel prediction that shows the intentionality? Because I don't know how we measure something like that outside of our physical brains, which you're arguing is kind of not part of your framework, because intentionality is before the fact that we have brains, which just seems backwards to me.
No, okay, so I can get into consciousness if you want. I'm an idealist. I don't want to get too sidetracked, but no, when you say, with the problem of underdetermination, that's why I'm looking at it I'm trying to apply it through the theoretical virtues. And I think we have the best explanation, given that criteria. And then there's also with the increasing complexity of these different life forms that shows it takes more work, more things have to come together for certain things than others. And so that's another, we can infer intentionality. And I'm saying this is.
Are we inferring it on the part? I guess I'm trying to figure out where we're inferring it. We're inferring it from kind of the local presentation and then extrapolating that to kind of the whole.
No, so we're looking at it like we're starting from the top and like, why we have like, a life permitting universe, and why we have the precise cluster of galaxies that we have, why we have the precision, like the solar system is just the way it is, why we have, things like the planetary collision with Thela 4.5 billion years ago, why we have like, things like the origin of life and this microbial life that paves the way for future advanced life, and then eventually intelligent conscious agents and everything. These are some incredible sets of facts that theism is going to predict and would be a better explanation. And I'm saying naturalism has no explanatory power for this. It's going to have to be a brute fact. The physics and fine-tuning under naturalism is simply a brute fact.
Yeah.
Whereas under theism,
so I actually don't
expected.
Well, so I don't necessarily see problems in a brute fact, right? I mean, like
I don't either.
Yeah. So I guess it'd be, if you're talking about like explanatory virtue versus like simplicity, it's like, yeah, I guess I get that. If you have more than you need, you need to shave off kind of that extra bit. But I'm trying to see the best way to, because like, what would how would you falsify this intention perspective like that?
Okay.
Because that's if this is like truly a scientific inquiry in any way, like I would expect to see some way to falsify it, right? So then that way the moral naturalist and you are kind of like, okay, we don't see the intentionality, which if we pull the string back, then we get to all the way back to the fine tuning or whatever.
Right. So I think you bring up a great point there. That's something I thought about too, because when I'm trying to formulate this argument and I'm thinking of objections myself, and one thing with that is let me see. Okay, so one thing, if we can find something like that takes more complexity for moral agents, then that would disprove my whole thesis. Like, the amount of precision it takes to go into embody moral agents, if we can find that same degree or greater of precision is needed for some other type of phenomena, then I'll have to concede my argument.
But doesn't that seem to be like, and I'm just going off the top of my head, but doesn't it seem like what you're saying is the thing that needs to be demonstrated is the thing that my theory says is impossible? Because it seems like you're stating that, well, it would have to not be the thing I'm stating, but you're basically saying it necessarily has to be that way, especially if it comes from God, right? Or is it a contingency, or how does that work?
I mean, it does. I mean, I think I would disagree with you there, because it gives us some kind of testability. Like, I was laying out the complexity of successive categories. Well, if there's some other type of phenomena that has more precision that goes into it, then it falsifies my theory, and that's something that's very much discoverable. And
wait, so okay, maybe I misheard. You said if what was more precise? I'm sorry.
Okay, so how I laid out, the precision that goes into things like a life permitting universe.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so with the different life forms, like with all this in mind, the complexity that goes into like simple life to more advanced life to human agents and then conscious moral agents and everything. Okay, so with that level of precision of the fourth category, if there's some other phenomenon in the universe that has more precision than that fourth category, then it disproves like what I've said. I would have to concede and abandon this type of argument.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering though. It's like, if you're saying it has to be this way, and we are here, then nothing would falsify it, right? I mean, because it's going to be rested upon your argument that this is the product of. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do see what you're saying, but I'm saying it's plausible that someday we could find like some sort of star phenomena or some kind of other observation. Then if this other observation has more complexity than it goes into moral agents, then we could say the universe is more fine-tuned for this for that phenomena than it is for moral agents, and so it's falsifiable.
Sure. I mean, I guess another part of that, right, was like why it would even have to be fine-tuned for moral agents. Like, I don't see a contradiction in the fact that the intentionality aspects could be all at play, but you don't have the rise of normativity or moral facts, yet a God was still responsible.
So in other words, are you saying something like, could God create without the fine tuning? I'm not sure.
I'm basically saying I don't see how it logically follows that, like, if they're moral agents, like a God must be responsible in the same sense that if there is no normativity, there couldn't be a God. I would say there could be a God that created a universe where normativity doesn't exist.
Okay, so
I guess that's why it's kind of like the fine tuning argument in general, right? It's like you can have an atheist that that agrees with fine tuning and there's no God, right? And you can have a theist that thinks God exists but there's no fine tuning,
right? And so what I'm doing is, like, if you granted the fine tuning data that I laid out, I'm saying I'm trying to offer the best explanation of the data. I'm trying to run it through the theoretical virtues and have a good explanation of why things are the way they are.
Sure.
And I'm not just looking at the physics and fine tuning, but it would also incorporate other facts of reality. It would be an expected matter, of course, under theism. And so I think we have a good explanation here.
So maybe we could. I know Santi wanted us to kind of go into back, and I want to rush back into that if we can, in terms of what we've all kind of said right now. Then. And we're talking about the fact that, you know, you have normativity being, or moral, I think you said embodied moral agents kind of being the product of this. Why does God even need the physical constants or normativity? Why is any of that even necessary from the perspective of, like, see, that seems to me to be something more you would expect in physics, right? Physics. I'm sorry, something you would expect more in naturalism than you would in than atheism.
Yeah, okay. So that brings up the.
Hold on, Travis. So I think that what JMIKE just said is a very interesting question, and I would like to see what both of you think, as far as, like, taking that into consideration, but also the fact that, like, sometimes what people say that fine tuning leads to a God, or at least to an intelligent agent, is because we would expect under naturalism, like, small little pockets of disorder here and there, rather than seeing the universe as it is as a whole, working together to have this universe, life, and all that stuff.
Well, I'm kind of saying that it undercuts the God for you to have limitations like this. Like, he can only create life, and life can only exist in virtue of very specific constants at which God has to work with. One, it's weird that an omnipotent being can get tripped up for any reason at all on its way to creating the universe, as well as things that persist in it. And then two, why does it care what atoms are doing or molecules are doing, or the mass of a neutrino, or whether or not, like, there's some, like, beta decay? Like, why does any of that matter when a God could just make it happen?
Gotcha. So and I want to, like, take some time and address this, although it kind of was, like, in my argument. So we get this objection of, okay, so why does God have to use, like, physics and fine tuning? Like, is he constrained within the laws of physics? Like, why is that the objection you're going with?
Yeah, it just seems it just seems to cut. It limits the God to this thing that needs. It almost seems like those constants are necessary, but God's supposed to be necessary. And if God's necessary, then the constants can be contingent. So
okay, and so there's kind of a misunderstanding with that objection. Okay, so under theism, like, God would have created the very laws of physics and narrow conditions in the first place. What I'm saying is he has an intentionality to create moral agents in a moral theater, and these narrow conditions are a byproduct of intentionality. Kind of like when I gave the example, if I want to raise my hand, I simply intend to raise my hand, and these natural processes flow as a byproduct of my intentionality. And so I'm not saying God is constrained.
Well, but if it is in order for embodied moral agents, then it's just kicking the can down the road to say, in order for the moral embodied agents, then it must abide by this limitation at which subsequently produces that, right? As opposed to just God just doing that, and then you have the instance of that, or some other processes that's maybe like the difference between being sober and taking an acid trip, something like you couldn't even put into words, right? Like, I don't know. It seems like you're just kicking the can down the road, if I'm hearing you right.
No, I don't think so. And one thing in this, I have some notes on, like, natural problems of natural evil too, if we want to get into that. But I think God uses, I think these natural processes that come about are necessary for embodied moral agents to form justified true beliefs and make these moral decisions. That we need these type of processes that come about, through evolutionary processes in order for us to have epistemic justification of our moral beliefs.
And so you would define knowledge in that kind of JTB category then?
Yeah, we're like a Swinburnian.
Okay, because I didn't know how committed you are there, because my first thing is, what about Gettier cases, right? But I'm a skeptic, so you probably expect me to kind of just be more skeptical on things that are thrown out there. Yeah, sure. I don't. But again, I feel like you're just stating that we're creating a circumstance at which can only arise with maybe you hold to this or not, the JTB count of knowledge for us to have the intelligibility of life, and then as well as like being embodied moral agents with normativity or some standard of behavior. Then I still feel like we're still in the same stoplight of why it needs any of those things to get to the desired outcome, and why the desired outcome couldn't be contingent upon an infinite, like why there couldn't be possible worlds, right? You have a possible world, God's necessary, every possible world, all these things are contingent. Why those couldn't be contingent ad infinitum? I don't get that. So
this would kind of get into something like I would hold to a soul building theodicy, that I think God intends to bring out about these moral agents, and there's this, we need, and so he wants them to soul build and to gain epistemic knowledge of moral virtues. And so with that intentionality, these processes come about for that soul building. You could say to prepare for eternity with being like God and things of that nature.
Okay, so so now to me though, like especially me as a skeptic, like you've just packed on more on things that, like, so your explanation for that, for something that I'm already skeptical of, is soul building. So now we've introduced the soul, some other ontology, right? And so now I feel like all we're doing is kind of throwing things in the box, and it's making it harder to pick out the toy that we want to examine and look at.
I don't think so, because that was in the original thing, to make morally significant decisions in a moral theater. This is where we soul build, and it would go back to it being moderately probable that God as a moral agent would want to bring about moral agents like himself that soul build their way to him. I think that's, and especially under the proposition of theistic idealism, it's simple, unifying, explains all the facts that we see in reality.
Yeah, I guess
it's gonna have much less brute facts, instead of saying like the mathematical description of the universe it's just simply a brute fact. Physics and fine tuning, brute fact, all these brute facts. Like this would be more expected, and so I think with this argument, I do think we can make it abductively probable that it points in the theistic direction. I don't see that as being controversial at all. That this would be more expected under theism than naturalism.
Okay, so
because these are competing hypotheses. Like we're dealing with metaphysical naturalism or theism. So we're trying to explain these sets of facts, and theism is going to have that explanatory power within, and that's why I said the intentionality that's measurable with these successive categories.
So I guess my hang up there is like when we say that it's more probable, and then first off, I appreciate like kind of the goal, at least what you're trying to do from my perspective, is limiting these kind of brute facts and having more parsimony and or having a better explanatory scope and virtue of it being more simple. Okay, all those things I appreciate getting to that conclusion, but I don't feel like it's successful in that I feel like we're starting with something that's less parsimonious by definition, right? We've added this new ontology of God, but then for all the explanations that I've heard you give me, we're adding things like the soul, moral agency, which I don't agree that normativity exists. Right. We've added like 7 different things, different ontologies that I'm now need separate arguments for those things that I don't know how it would be less parsimonious in any way for me to just state the natural world exists through, it's a brute fact. There's unguided processes at which get us. It could be the case that these constants are they have to be this way. But I don't see how, like, one, I don't see how that gets you to the God. And then I don't know how all these other things, like if I was a moral naturalist, I could just say these things exist, and I don't need to add the extra, the souls, the gods. And then if we crack open the egg and spill it out, from your perspective as a Christian, we still have to deal with the fact of whether or not the Trinitarian aspect is necessary to it, right? It seems that we're not, I guess this is one of the issues I have in the discussions usually, and there's nothing against theists at all or Christians, but I feel like a lot of the metaphysics are on the back end that we don't really throw on the table right away. It's to when we get to this point in the conversation where I'm like, okay, well, now there's 7 things like normativity and souls and things like that, that I don't know how that's supposed to convince me when I don't think they exist in the first place. Gotcha.
Okay. And trust me, I very much understand your objection, and I'm even sympathetic to it. But I'm going to maintain that it is the most simplistic, because it's pure. It's number one, I'm an idealist, so it's mind, it's intentionality, like agency, a moral agent. And so it's probable, under that hypothesis, it's moderately probable that he would intend to bring about moral agents like himself, and this would be the best way. And so it's not, all of these things would be expected, and as it turns out, it's exactly what we observe. So I would disagree that I'm tacking on brute facts to save the hypothesis. I'm sympathetic to that objection, but I don't think I'm doing it here.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to state whether or not like these things are necessarily like brute contingencies that you're adding. Mm-hmm. It's more so that it's like you're adding, I guess, the explanation of you'll go like, well, we start with the fine tuning, right? It's like, okay, we use the argument for embodied moral agents. Well, now I'm like sitting there going, yeah, but that's not going to convince me as someone who's an anti-realist, because I don't think normativity exists. And then we go in, it's like, well, that's necessary because of the soul building aspect. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't believe that the soul thing exists, nor is there a life before my life starts existing. It does seem like if we just throw away like the brute facts aspects of it, we're adding more metaphysical commitments than what I would probably want in my ontology, right?
Yeah. See, again, I'm gonna disagree, because it's not these. It's intending to bring about moral agency in a moral theater. That's all I'm postulating, and it's that it would be expected under theism, and it explains the sets of facts. And so it comes from a simple ontology, the mind of God, and it explains all of the data we see. And we can make these probability assessment that it's likely that if God is has these characteristics, he would want to create creatures like himself that were I don't really follow the objection.
Well, for one, when you state that it's expected for these embodied moral agents, I don't think that's true for one of the issues I said earlier, which is that you could have a God at which does not have the desires to have that, right? So you're kind of begging the question that the God is finely tuned to create moral agents. We've kicked the can down the road so far that now you just assume this God is the God itself is the same problem that the theist would have to the naturalist. This God is finely tuned for that reason, for the desires to have that outcome. But it could be the case that the God has these desires finely tuned where normativity doesn't arise, right? That there isn't. So that's where I don't understand that at all.
Okay, yeah. Let me address that. And so, when we talk about, like unified facts of like reality, like, these are grand theories. And so I would postulate theism with God as being absolute perfection. And so with absolute perfection, you would expect these certain, it would be expected, and it would be more parsimonious and more powerful. And, absolute perfection is going to be more simple than like an evil God or a plurality of gods.
Well, how do you define perfection?
That which nothing can be greater.
See, so I have a separate issue with perfection, is that I would define perfection as something that merely exists, right? If like I'm perfect, I'm in a state of perfection, I don't need to create, I don't need intentionality for moral facts to exist. If I'm perfect, I don't even need to take a step left, I don't need to take a step right, I don't need to breathe. I'm in a perfect state. For me to do anything else, to go from X to Y, means I had a desire to do something. And if I had a desire to do something, I wasn't perfect because I'm trying to satisfy something at which I don't currently have. So I think a better definition of perfect would be something that merely exists in a state of perfection, right? Anything that it does negates that status of perfection, right? So I feel like that now we'd be in a semantic game of like, I don't even know what it means for something to be perfect in the same way people make greatness arguments. Seems to be kind of an arbitrary distinction.
So a perfectly good being, and, you know, it would be probable, you know, because I would say that moral virtues in creating creatures, you know, that would build their way to, you know, these kind of things are good traits. They're good properties, you know, for a perfect being to have. So if he's just, you know, absolute perfection and everything, I think it would be greater for him to create agents that can work their way to him.
But how do you get
we could get on the back and forth on that.
Sure.
I could just disagree with your definitions of God.
It's that if we get to this aspect of like, so because you said good making, so if we're going like, if you're I don't know if you're invoking like good making properties or something like that, but if you kind of get into that route, now we're in an a priori argument about, you know, God being this necessarily perfect, great thing. And we just don't even need the fine tuning argument at all anymore, because you could just convince me with a more powerful a priori argument.
Well, yeah.
Let's go ahead and do another.
The argument is for moral.
Hold on, Travis. Let's do like another maybe 9 minutes or something, and then we'll try to do a little bit of Q&A.
Sure.
Just because we don't want to go too long, but then we want to give the audience a little bit of an opportunity to ask questions.
I didn't realize it's already been an hour. Sorry.
I know.
This is like, been like 15 minutes. Sorry.
Right, go ahead, Travis.
Okay, so all right, I was taking notes. What was the objection you wanted me to address?
Well, I guess, first, I don't want to like straw man and say that you are running this argument when potentially you're not. I might be getting ahead of myself.
Okay.
But when you mentioned good making property, or you said these are good making property, I think you said they're good making properties,
right? Which
signals to me that if that's what you said, now we could be getting into some modal ontological argument, which is fine. But that's an argument which Plantinga's kind of like pushing all his chips in, right? If he's right, he's cashing in God exists. And that is a much more powerful argument than some a posteriori argument for me to get there, right? Because you could just convince me deductively, and then we don't even need the fine-tuning argument.
Right. And what I'm doing is, you know, so theism is going to postulate just one entity, God, with very simple properties. And so that's going to be more simple than let's say a necessary natural state. That, you know, it's going to have this better explanatory power. And, you know, with the objections of like why God does this, you know, I think as a moral agent, he would want to bring about other moral agents. I think God, and we can kind of define this in terms of classical theism too, that God, God is the good, you know, God is morality. And so he creates.
Well, what finally tunes that to be the case?
So he intends for moral agents, okay? And then you get all this fine-tuning as a byproduct of his intentionality. And we can look at this fine-tuning data and trace the intentionality for conscious, intelligent moral agents.
Yeah, I guess, but it's like, why couldn't it just be a God that doesn't, right? It doesn't do, like, it seems that you're going to, those kind of, maybe it's the a priori good-making property argument, seems to serve itself as a way to show why this God's finely tuned for this. But if it's the case that that's the argument for it, we don't even need the fine-tuning argument. You've just deductively convinced me a God exists.
Okay, so I'm not, with this objection.
Do you follow? I mean, if you don't follow that objection, I can try to restate it. I just want to make sure you're tracking what I'm saying.
You broke up.
Well, I say if I need to restate it, I want to make sure you're tracking my objection.
Yeah. So you're basically saying, why would God intend to bring about moral agents? Is that?
I'm saying, like, it could be the case that God intends to create a universe with just black holes, right? And now we're in the same problem with fine tuning to begin with. Okay,
so no, my argument kind of addressed this. But
that was kind of the issue, was to say that your argument for it was serving as an a priori argument to set that up, but we don't even need to go to fine tuning, because if your a priori argument's successful, you've deductively convinced me God exists. And so why don't even we go to the fine tuning? I'm a theist now at that point, once I accept that.
So all I'm doing is I'm postulating God is with very simple properties of morality, and his intentionality to create moral agents. Okay. And then, I think it would be moderately probable that he would intend to bring about moral agents. And this fine tuning we get is just a byproduct of that. And so it's a way we can measure and trace the intentionality. And I even gave a way we can do that with comparing the complexity of the successive categories of 1 through 4. And with the black holes and everything, well, it takes a lot more precision for the evolutionary process to bring about intelligent moral agency than it does for, a black hole or a supernova or something like that to form. And so with this complexity, we see, I think this is indeed a way we can trace intentionality. And so it's all lining up. It's simple. It explains what we see in reality. And so, again, I'm not seeing any good defeater to saying, abductively, this would be more expected under theism.
It's expected given what your presumption of what the God is or needs in order for those things to be the contingent byproduct of it. But my issue is that I could just say the universe is necessary, and then all the things that come about it, just kind of flow from that. There's this necessary singularity, and all these constants kind of just flow from that. But if we take it step back on your argument, and you say there's this God, and it's just necessary, all of its properties are just necessary, and then it has this contingent aspect of creating. Well, then I don't know if the fine tuning is even necessary, because it's just contingent. You could just do whatever at that point. But then it's
well,
it seems I'm not sure. I'm not sure how, though. At least I'm not.
Okay, so with the fine. Okay, so God intends moral agency, right? And you're saying, well, why do we need the fine tuning, or what purpose does it really serve? And what the fine tuning does, it's a way of measuring the intentionality, like with the increasing complexity of successive categories.
Well, no.
We see more work that goes into moral agency than other phenomena, and so it gives us a way of testing.
I think you keep going. I'm hoping I'm tracking this right, but it seems like you're going to the fine tuning part of the universe. I'm talking about why the God to start with has why it's finely tuned for those desires to have the moral. It's the same argument at which you would object to for the naturalist to say it's just
well, no,
it's just necessarily that way. But the argument for you would be well, God's just necessarily that way. And then if your explanation is, well, here's this a priori modal ontological argument for great making properties, well, then we don't even need the fine tuning, because now we've just substituted an a priori deduction at which I should just accept, and then I believe in God if that's the case.
Can you please repeat that? I'm so sorry.
So we have the idea of the God having these desires, right? To create whatever it might be. And it sounds like what you're saying is that's just necessarily the way God is.
Okay.
But it's also based upon these, we know that because of these good making properties, right? If that's what you're saying, and that's part of a modal ontological type of argument, right? Or any a priori argument to get you there. One, we don't need the fine tuning, because you would just be able to convince me deductively.
Sure.
But to set
I'm not really going with that type of argument. What I'm doing.
Sure, but if I set that aside now and I say we don't need, skip that.
Okay.
It's for you to say it's necessary that God is that way, and for me to say it's necessary that the universe is that way without the God means I have one less thing than you do in my theory, and it's more parsimonious.
No, it's not going to be, because if you have like you're saying a necessary initial state, and the universe simply causally unfolds, you're going to have to posit much more brute facts. Like, for example, the fact that we have these physics and fine tuning in the first place, brute fact. Okay. The fact that, we evolved in this way and can do science and have this intelligent consciousness and why are universes describable in mathematical terms, why laws of logic apply, and all these different things. They're all going to have to be brute facts. Whereas under theism, under this intentionality, this intelligence and intentionality, it would be expected. And so it's a more parsimonious explanation with less brute facts.
Well, but I think you're kind of starting. So you're starting with this intentionality, but we only know it in virtue of kind of the end product, or not. I wouldn't want to say end product, but
well, see, we're looking for
where we're at right now. We have brains, we have intentionality, we have
right.
desires, normativity, we have all these types of things, or claims of normativity.
Sure.
But for you to say it's better to assume that exists first, as opposed to observing this a posteriori that as a byproduct of natural processes or unguided processes, of which you've said you've accepted evolution.
Yes.
The issue is, like, why are we bringing that at the front if we have no novel predictions to state that, but all our predictions go that consciousness is some emergent property? But that might get into your idealism aspect, I'm sure. So
yes. And so, part of it is not just moral agency, but the fact that we have conscious agents, that we're intelligent, that we can, make, do scientific discoveries, and that our universe is intelligible, and these different facts. Again, I think the abductive case kind of goes through that it would be a more expected matter of course under theism than these different brute facts.
Okay, I know you were trying to get in, so I didn't want to.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just let's make this the last thing we address before we go into Q&A. So if you have anything else to say, Jay, just go ahead and say it, and then Travis can respond to that, and then we'll just jump to the Q&A.
No, I mean, I know you tried to jump in a minute ago, and I felt like I was kind of cutting off Travis, so I didn't want to. I want to give him the last word there for sure, but I might address that in like closing statements if we do that or something like that.
Yeah, we can have like a 3-minute, 5-minute statement closing.
Mine will be like probably 4. I'm so terrible with coming up with a closing statement. So
I usually don't do them, but
well, yeah, then we just skip it. It doesn't matter to me. But
well, I mean, okay, we could do like a summary.
Summary. Yeah. That'd be great.
All right, well, let's do that. Do you have anything else to say, Jay? And then
sure,
you can let Travis respond, or
yeah,
you want to go to Q&A?
Yeah. So I guess just off the top of my head, issues I have if we're starting kind of here at the baseline of the embodied moral agents is, I don't think it logically or deductively follows that you would have, in I guess both circumstances, a God existing that couldn't create a world without normativity. I don't see a logical contradiction in that. I don't see a logical contradiction in moral facts existing absent a God. My co-host is a moral naturalist, so he believes in that. So I don't think it needs to be fine-tuned for those things. That would just, I think that's probably something that me and Travis could talk about for a while. I love talking about metaphysics or meta ethics and things like that. Yeah. So I'd love to get more on that. Also, I'm not sure how we've calculated probabilities, and I'm not sure how we've determined that the God's desires itself doesn't suffer kind of the same problem at which the proponents argue against, which is why the God has those desires instead of maybe one which is just black hole permitting and not life permitting. But yeah, I mean, hopefully we can do another conversation, and then I think we know positions a little better. Maybe we can narrow down one specifically, either the moral aspect of the fine tuning or back it all the way up to the constants or something like that. But thank you, Santi, and everybody for having me.
All right.
So,
Travis?
Yeah, so really enjoyed this conversation. It's like really good to meet JMIKE and talk to him. Hopefully we can have more conversations in the future. And so one thing, I do want to address, like, before, I kind of give my closing, is, this idea of, God intending this. Well, why should God intend this and everything? And so, like, under like necessary existence and things like that, of like contingencies, God and his intentionalities, it will probably be a brute fact. At that point, I am postulating a brute fact of, this intelligent agency that would intend this, but that's the only brute fact. And so these other facts of reality would flow from that one fact. And so it's going to have less brute facts, I think. And to kind of, I guess, close, I really appreciated the conversation, and I like hearing these objections I'm kind of, this is the argument I'm formulating, like with the complexity of successive categories, is very much a work in progress that I'm just kind of having fun with and working on it. And so I appreciate, getting this kind of feedback. And I think it does stand abductively that, there is this increasing ratio with categories 1 through 4. Under theism, it would explain it, and I think it would offer the best explanation. And so I think there's a plausible reason in that case that God exists, but I certainly respect those who disagree.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciate both of you were willing to have this conversation, and JMIKE for taking your time to being here. Travis, same.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you guys for bearing with me on the reschedule, because that was really nice of you guys to do that in short notice. So
absolutely.
Oh yeah, that's good.
Yeah, it was worth it, man. It's a cool conversation.
Yeah, and Travis, I immensely respect your knowledge and science and applying it, because it's really refreshing, to be honest, to hear. Yeah. So
I love
want
science.
To throw that out there. So.
Yeah, and one thing is I love science, and I love science absent theism. Like I kind of combine the two now that I'm a theist, but that aside, like I love science.
Yeah. I'd watched some of your clips and I was impressed, but I appreciate, there's times at which you probably could have slapped me and been like, dude, shut up. And so I appreciate, you bearing with me.
I want to hear, I wanted to hear like your feedback, man. Yeah. And I thought it was good. And, I respect those that say, well, this doesn't seem the best explanation to me. That's fine. I think I have a decent case, but I certainly respect those who disagree. And so I just kind of want to put it out there and conversate about it, really.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we have a question here from Don, and he's asking Travis, what would a world look like without positing a God as a fine tuner?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. And okay, so one thing that I find that's really interesting is like in the first milliseconds of the Big Bang, okay, when the fundamental force splits and you have the 4 fundamental forces that come. Well, matter and antimatter were formed in almost equal amounts. For every 1 billion pair of quarks, anti-quarks, there was an extra quark. And it's that one extra quark that prevents the universe from devolving into pure radiation. It's so interesting that with this matter to antimatter, without the 1 to a billion, the universe would have exploded. They explode into a photon, right? So the universe would have exploded in the radiation, which is, so one is a universe with just radiation. And, they'll say things like, with the expansion rate, like had it, it could have collapsed back on itself, not formed stars, galaxies. So there's a whole possible things. I mean, I think you would probably have something like a universe, with like various elements. I wouldn't expect, things like the cluster of galaxies being as they are, the solar, I would expect, I wouldn't expect what we have. But I mean, I'm just taking that's just my perspective. I think that's an interesting question. Like, what's a naturalistic universe look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Don's stealing the questions I wish I would have asked. Also, Travis, I kind of hope, if anything, God fine tunes the universe tomorrow to have my fantasy football team win. So that'd be great.
Well, you got a soul build. So I can't guarantee it. There's that soul building thing.
Well, it hasn't worked for me in years. So,
all right. Well, here's a question for JMIKE. JMIKE is saying, why did God do things the way he did? Kind of hard to answer that because he wanted to. I thought that was a question, so I think that was more of a comment.
Yeah. Well, if I can respond to it, it's really my objection there is to, I think even it was like Dawkins even, it said, who find the fine tuner or whatever, which is kind of tandem to what I'm saying. I don't really think his formulation of philosophical arguments are very fruitful from my perspective, but it is just the idea that from the same objection, that in which someone could say the universe is necessary. And that's just the way it is. I don't see why it wouldn't suffer an issue for me to ask why God's desires are the way they are, especially if it's a necessary being or something. So it's more so to kind of mirror the argument, or I think it's called a stalking horse. I don't know if I'm using the term right, but yeah. So
yeah, and so if I could kind of touch on that, one thing is, what we do posit is going to have, transcendent properties. And so there, I'm kind of trying to use a way that we can deduce properties from that transcendent cause, because we got to be careful we don't make a categorical error in something that's transcendent of space-time, matter, and energy, describing it in terms of space-time, matter, and energy. But to go back to kind of what JMIKE's objection was, and just to kind of steelman, if we grant it, we'd just say, well, that would be one thing we just posit as brute fact, but we still have less brute facts overall. But I think, under contingency, I think at some point you're going to have at least one brute fact. And
well, I would agree with the category error, because, but probably from the other side, from me to you, that you don't see the word transcendent causes anywhere in cosmology, astrophysics, anything. It's just a term that we've made up. Sure. And so that's kind of my issue, is that it could be the case, but as far as I'm concerned, it's just some word we use to serve as a placeholder, because we don't actually know the answer yet. But again, I'm a skeptic and probably won't fully be satisfied anyway. So
there's just no making you happy.
Yeah, exactly.
You never know, though.
A little skeptic joke, but yeah.
All right. So here's a question from Daniel. He's asking, would JMIKE know what evidence for God will look like?
God does. And God has that ability to change my mind right now, and it doesn't do that. So I will wait at the other side of the court while God serves the volleyball, because I'm waiting. I would love to believe in the truth if that's what exists, but it is not up to me to find the champion hide and seek player. If it is deliberately hiding from me, it knows exactly my intentional states, what I desire, what I'll do next. It knows all those things. So it'll know exactly what would convince me. And if it's the case that it doesn't want to do that, then God is playing favorites. So
you're not convinced. I haven't convinced you.
No. Philosophical. Well, it's not your fault. Getting into philosophy has made me more of I guess the definition that theists prefer for atheists, which is that God doesn't exist.
Right. Yeah.
So
I respect that. Yeah.
I've kind of moved away from the new atheist camp, so to speak. So not your fault for not convincing me. A lot of breaking down my beliefs kind of did that. I was a spiritualist at first, if that helps you out in any way. So
interesting. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So my
hence my hippiness,
Let's jump to the next one.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Here's Don, and he is not playing favorites, I guess. So he's asking JMIKE a question. Could God just be an as yet undiscovered natural force or field?
Well, no, 'cause the way I define like naturalism or natural things is in virtue kind of theology, right? It's to say that, in classical theology, you have God, and then you have God creating the natural world. And so I like to use that distinction, right? I'm saying that the natural world, as a naturalist, or the natural world in that worldview is absent the God. So the second we add that into there, no, it's not a natural fact. It's a supernatural fact.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because I think one of the things that, and very slightly would distinguish me from JMIKE, is I would agree with him that these are natural processes. It's just I'm postulating God as the explanation for the natural processes. But I'm very much a proponent of methodological naturalism myself, and I accept naturalism in all its shape, form, fashion.
Yeah, and that was actually something in my opening statement I was wanted to ask you, but I think we both kind of agree on its methodological approach, as opposed to being like all that exists is the natural world as a metaphysical thesis. So we definitely have agreement there then.
All right. This question is kind of similar to the last one. What would a God have to look like for him to believe that there's a God? And that will be for you, Jay.
Sorry, I was looking at another comment where it said that hair would take a long time to dry. I got out of the shower before the debate; it's still drying. So I put it that way. So, but anyway, explain internal question. What would a God have to look like in order for him to believe there's a God? I don't know. It could be of divine simplicity without parts. So I don't limit things like that. I'm not going to be crass in that sense. But again, it would just be the same kind of answer of the God would know what it would take if I do subconsciously imagine it being of something, right? And I just don't know it. Well, the God would know it, and it would know that, hey, if I was put myself in this form, JMIKE would be convinced, because that's what would convince him. I don't think that's the case. I think it's just the case that a God would have to convince me, and it knows exactly what it could do to do that.
Yeah, divine hiddenness is a huge topic in the philosophy of religion that goes well beyond this discussion. So.
Did I say divine hiddenness? I meant to say divine simplicity.
No, I was saying that about you being convinced.
Yeah, sorry. There's a brain
so
fart.
let me I imagine that somebody will probably say this in the comments and before they say it. What if they say that, and I don't mean this, in any way, but I'm just trying to pick your brain on this. What if they say that, or what if you have built an epistemology that prevents you from seeing, like, for example, even evidence that could in some ways be valid and good and all that stuff, but yet you won't accept it because your epistemology doesn't allow you to do that?
So my epistemology doesn't get in the way. My epistemology updates accordingly. Like I'm a skeptic, first and foremost, or even I wouldn't call myself a philosopher, but at least I would say, or a philosopher first. I'm an atheist second as a byproduct of that. So in that discourse of philosophy, which epistemology is a subset of, then I am, it's going to be the same process at which gets me to atheism, which is that my epistemic framework would be updated. I would have some evidence in some form. Do I know what that looks like? Like I answered before, no, I don't, but doesn't rule out the possibility that we could know what that looks like in the future. So I just update. I'd still be a skeptic because I applied those same principles and it got me to theism, but I would no longer be an atheist. So.
All right. So would you say that divine hiddenness is like one of the topics that perhaps seem to be the strongest argument for you as far as like evidence for God? Like, your biggest objection?
No, not really. Honestly, there's more arguments that I would like in causal closure and things like that, where I'm going to, which is going to be why I affirm pretty much that the God does not exist. Divine hiddenness isn't like an affirmation that there is no God. I do think that the argument for non-belief or divine hiddenness is one of the best and most convincing for most people. I think the problem of evil is very convincing for people. I also don't think that the problem of evil is a very good argument. So it's not the number one, but it is it is something with some power, I think, but it's definitely not the main thing.
All right.
Yeah, and I had actually done some notes. We didn't get to it, but I was in anticipation for like natural evils and like, why is there death in this violent evolutionary process? I took a lot of notes on that, but that's okay. But I will concede that I think the problem of natural evil is probably the best argument for atheism. It's something that, really makes us think,
Yeah.
Because it's not something that comes from people's decisions. It's that comes from nature. And like, why is it so harmful? And so I think that's one of the more compelling arguments for atheism. Now, I do think it has an explanation, but sure. I would concede that that's a good argument.
And if I can, please, I hate to do this, but I know I've kind of gone back and forth with Slam a little bit. He comes onto our channel, but he posted something that probably is the biggest problem I have with anything that would be said tonight at all. I tell people to ask 10 people who they know well, and if they experienced or knew of someone they knew who experienced a real miracle divine hiddenness solved. no. Like as David Hume said, revelation is necessarily first person. For you to tell me you think that you had a miracle only tells me that that's what you perceive happened to you. It doesn't state that you are right about it. That's arrogance and hubris to say that whatever you think the explanation is without investigating further. More so said, ad populum is just fallacious. The fact that 10 people would tell you that is no indication on the truth value of whether they actually experienced a miracle. And it does me no good hearing about other people's miracles at which they could be mistaken. So to me, that's no offense, Slam. I think that's one of the worst arguments that theists use, is just to say, have someone tell you about their experience. Well, that does me no good. Was that supposed to convince me? I didn't have the experience. So.
Let me touch on that real quick from the theist perspective, because I would see it differently, perhaps, than Slam. I think, now I don't talk about the nature, but I have had moments where I've experienced like the presence of God and things of that nature. But that's for I don't use that as argument for God like to somebody else. Like that's good for me, but I mean, it's not going to do anything for a skeptic. I mean, so yeah, I wouldn't use that to argue for God to somebody else. That's something that's internal to myself. Sure. That's how, as a theist, that's how I interpret it.
And I'm sorry for misgendering Slam. I did not know. I had made an assumption that was poor on my part.
Yeah. We're actually Facebook friends.
Yeah. Well, I might be confusing Slam with somebody else anyway. So that could have been because the person I'm thinking of is, or at least I was assuming was by the pronouns he and him. So anyway.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions. So if you guys have any final thoughts, we can go ahead and just give those and then call it a night.
Just cool conversation. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate the reschedule again. That was awesome for you guys to do. I didn't want it to feel like I was trying to bail, so I appreciate that.
You're good.
All right. Well, with that, thank you all so much for being here tonight. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate the fact that JMIKE took the time to be here tonight. Travis, again, thank you guys. I felt like this was a pretty good conversation, and hopefully in the future we can have more. For all of you guys watching, if you guys found this conversation helpful, don't forget to share, subscribe, like, and if you guys have any thoughts, don't forget to share them down below in the comment section. Don't go too hard on either one of these guys. That's not cool.
It's okay. You can troll.
I think me and Travis have heard every way that you could say a bad thing, especially if you do call-in shows and things like that. You'll hear every possible way what you said was wrong. So
amen.
That's all good.
All right. Well, with that, thank you guys again, and we'll see you guys later. Thank you so much.
Have a good one, guys.
All right. Have a good night.